because if they're put there, the Russians will target them and kill them. In my recent trip to Europe and just reading the media and talking to all sorts of European friends, I think the Russophobia there is about at the same level as it is here. I think it's worst in Britain of all the European countries. I think Britain is right up there with us at the top of the ladder, but it's profound all across Europe. I think what they wanted to do is see if they could convince him to change his tune on Ukraine, to sort of act like a softer version of Joe Biden, number one. And number two, if that doesn't work, they want to do everything they can to kiss up to him, to make sure that he's not so angry or so contemptuous of them that he pulls American forces out of Europe. I think that's basically what they're doing. And I think they know that they're doomed on the Ukraine front, that Trump is not going to change his mind, and he's going to do everything he can to accommodate the Russians so that he can work out a deal over Ukraine. So you want to accept the reality that's facing us and figure out where to go from there. And basically, that leads you to the conclusion that it's best from our point of view, and here I'm talking about the United States, and it's best from Ukraine's point of view to shut this war down. And if it goes on, what's going to happen? More Ukrainians are going to get killed and they're going to lose more territory. Is that good? Not in my opinion. In my opinion, from both a moral and a strategic point of view, Trump is on the right track. The fact is that the United States refused to tell Ukraine that it would continue to provide security for it, that it would continue to support it in its war with Russia. So the mineral deal went nowhere. And again, this is why Zelensky is so frustrated today in this press conference before the meeting. Zelensky has no solution. The mineral deal didn't work out the way he wanted. So what is he going to do? And he misbehaved, and we saw the end result. The mineral deal, the whole idea was initiated by Zelensky. And really what he wanted to do was allow the United States to make a lot of money from Ukrainian minerals. And the quid pro quo would be that the United States would continue to provide security for Ukraine. My view is that it is likely that Trump will cut a deal with Trump and company surely know what the Russians want. They know what the Russian demands are. And it appears that they're willing to meet those demands. Otherwise, Trump wouldn't be saying that he had a really good conversation with Putin and that they understand each other and that he believes they can get a deal. So I think the deal is going to happen. So Netanyahu may be gloating now, but he would think long and hard, as many Israelis and their supporters should think about where this country is, where it's headed, and what that all adds up to, because this is not good. So the Israelis, they just do what they want. And again, the United States and the Europeans will back them no matter what. So what you see here is creeping annexation, and this is hardly surprising at all. Netanyahu talked about admiration for Israel. When I was young, there was a great deal of admiration for Israel in the United States and really around the world. But what's happened over time, and it's accelerated in the last few years, is that Israel has become a pariah state in almost all quarters. It's really quite remarkable. I believe here, even in the United States, there is a significant slice of the population that fully understands what Israel has become and where Israel is headed. And of course, as I've said on a number of occasions on this show, this situation's only going to get worse with time, because in those days, remember, I was there from 1966 to 1970. And the Israelis won the war in 1948. They won a war in 56, and then they won the 97 war, which was widely viewed as a classic military victory on a par with the German victory against France in 1940. So they were very highly regarded. And furthermore, in those days, the Israelis were considered David up against Goliath, because many of the myths that underpin that David versus Goliath worldview had not been shattered. But since, the early 1970s, my thinking, and I think the thinking of large numbers of people, including many Israelis, about Israel itself has changed significantly. But what Trump wants to do is shut down the war as soon as possible. And that is in Ukraine's interest. It's not in Ukraine's interest to continue this war. And although Zelensky thinks that's the case, he's just dead wrong. He has no real option here other than to go along with what President Trump wants. And as you and I have said on countless occasions, actually what Trump wants is what's best for Ukraine. Zelensky doesn't realize that, and most Ukrainians don't realize that. So in a very important way, I think that what Trump wants to do is good for Ukraine. He's made it very clear that Ukraine cannot be in NATO, and there's nothing that Zelensky can do to change that. Whether Zelensky came to Washington and behaved much the way Starmer and Macron did, or whether he behaved the way he actually did today, it just doesn't matter. Let's face it, he's between a rock and a hard place. He's the head of a country that is in the process of being destroyed. He has no way to fix the problem. And he's, I think, just frustrated beyond belief. And that was reflected in his performance today. Again, it wasn't a smart way to behave, for sure. But in a certain way, I can understand his frustration. Playing nice with Trump and Vance is not going to solve his problem, or at least it's not going to end up producing the result he wants, which is continuation of the war and support for the United States, from the United States for that enterprise. That's what he wants. What Zelensky wants is possible to get from the United States at this point in time, period, end of story. There's no way that we can turn this one around so that Ukraine wins. Joe Biden did everything he could to help the Ukrainians. And when Joe Biden left office, the Ukrainians were losing and the Russians were on the march. And there's no evidence that we have any way of altering the balance of power on the battlefield. Two simple reasons. One is the profound Russophobia in the West, and especially in the United States, because of the widespread belief that Putin is responsible for Trump winning in 2016. But that profound Russophobia gets in the way of seeing things clearly. I mean, that's the basic idea, to remake the world in our own image. We're the good guys. Anybody who doesn't have a liberal democratic system like us is a bad guy. And our basic goal is to transform those bad guys into good guys with the belief that we will all then live happily ever after. And then the other thing is that during the unipolar moment, when the Ukraine disaster was set in train, American foreign policy was not run according to realist dictates. It was run according to a liberal ideology. And that liberal ideology was very expansionist in nature. And it not only led to the forever wars, it also led to this crisis with Ukraine. You want to remember that we focus on NATO expansion when we talk about what caused this war, the Ukraine war, that is. But it's important to emphasize that it was just not NATO expansion, because NATO expansion was part of a package deal. And that deal included EU expansion as well as NATO expansion. And it included a color revolution. In the case of Ukraine, it was the Orange Revolution. And the idea was that we were going to put into power in Ukraine someone who would be sympathetic to the West, and we would turn Ukraine into a liberal democracy that was loyal to the United States. It's very important to understand that Donald Trump is the anomaly. And this is why so many Republicans and virtually all Democrats are screaming bloody murder about what Trump is doing with regard to U.S. relations with both Russia and the Europeans. The really important question was what were we going to do when the Cold War ended? The Soviet Union shortly thereafter disappeared, and we were the most powerful state in the world. We could have drawn down our commitments all over the world, reduced the number of bases, spent much less money on defense, But again, we pursued this liberal foreign policy that was designed to remake the world. And the end result is that, if anything, we increased the number of bases. We interfered in the politics of more countries than we even interfered in during the Cold War, and we spent huge amounts of money. But you want to remember that a lot of those bases and that huge Pentagon budget came out of the Cold War, which was a different story than what we saw in the unipolar moment. I like to say that the Republicans and the Democrats are Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's true as long as you exclude Trump. But if you bring Trump into the equation, the Republicans, with him at the helm, look very different than the Democrats. I think initially they thought the United States was so powerful that it could just shove NATO expansion into both Georgia and Ukraine down the Russians' throat. And then I think they also believed that if a war did break out, that we would beat the Russians. I think this is why there was no really serious move on our part to prevent a war in February of 2022. And this is why, once the war started, we advised Zelensky to walk away from the negotiations. We thought we had the Russians right where we wanted them, and we would inflict a decisive defeat on them. But you want to remember that we shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 1999, and then we did it again in 2004. And I think the widespread belief in the corridors of power in the United States, and this, of course, includes Victoria Nuland, was that we could do it again with regard to Ukraine. I think it's this mentality that informed her thinking, and of course the thinking of many others as well. I think the foreign policy establishment in the West, not just in the United States, but in the West, is so deeply committed to the narrative that Vladimir Putin is the equivalent of Adolf and that he is solely responsible for the war in Ukraine.